Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. I'm glad that you can be here. I am here on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and doing another round of question and perspective. So, if you are tuning in, I'll invite you to ask some of your questions, and wherever you are watching, I should be able to see those. Go ahead and drop those right in the comment section, and I will get to you as best I can. And so if you are watching, go ahead and just throw in some questions, and I will give you my perspective on those questions. One of the questions that I have been asked a lot lately, especially as I have been saying that it is time for us to ensure that programs are not cut, is Jesus's message about the poor always being with us. And sometimes people will say, if the poor are always with us, then why do we need to take care of them? And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what that text means. That text is not saying that we should do nothing to try and help people who are in need. It simply means that Jesus is telling us that if we do not care for people who are in need, if we don't take active measures, active steps to help people who are in need, then the poor will always be with us. So that's not a way of getting out of our responsibility to care for people. It is a statement saying that if we don't care for those in need, if we don't do what we're supposed to do, then absolutely the poor will always be with us. And so we have an obligation to care for people who are in need and to ensure that our societal structures take care of them as well. Go ahead, no matter where you're watching, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, go ahead and put your comments in the comment section, and I will do my best to see those and to keep up with all those in various places. Another question that I have been asked about recently is about the future of the church. And I don't know if you all saw this or not, but there was a study that came out, a survey that showed how mainline Protestants voted in the last several elections. And that information showed that mainline Protestants had voted majority Republican since the 2008 election. The 2008 election is the last one that was truly divided between Republicans and Democrats. But since that time, mainline Protestants have been voting more Republican than Democratic, including in the 2024 election. That is, with the exception of the Episcopal Church, which has still voted to more Democratic than Republican. And so I don't think that this was terribly shocking for me, but it was slightly shocking that we saw mainline Protestants also voting for Donald Trump in the majority. And I think that this just proves one of the problems with organized religion, that if organized religion is really only concerned with uh, its own preservation, its own existence, then it cannot be faithful. It just is not faithful. And so it's another good point that if religion isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is speaking the truth and love to the principalities and the powers, then why should it even exist? And so I think that's a good point. A lot of people will get scared whenever you talk about organized religion closing and shutting, especially a lot of people who are employed by the church, like I am. They'll say, well, if organized religion dies, how am I going to survive? And that's just not our concern, the perpetuation of systems. And so if organized religion is just going to feed into white Christian nationalism, if it's just going to feed into racism and homophobia and transphobia, then it can just go ahead and die because it's not being faithful to the message of Jesus Christ anyway. So that girl says on TikTok, what are the different forms of idolatry that take form in organized religion? And I think that's a great question. And I think just exactly some of the things that I was talking about, that a lot of times in organized religion, what we end up getting is just a a concern with dogma, with ensuring that there is proper belief and proper dogma. And I was reading in a Bible study yesterday, and one of the things that we were talking about was that when there was a shift from uh, from like religion being the oppressed religion, Christianity being the oppressed religion in the Roman Empire, to being the tool of oppression in the Roman Empire, then instead of being concerned with proper behavior, like doing the right things, what it ended up being concerned with was about policing individual morality, like individual sexual ethics, ensuring that people were believing the right things, concerned primarily with an afterlife or things like this. And those really weren't the original intent of Christianity. And so I think that whenever that change happened, it was a fundamental change in the religion. And so I think then that proper belief became dogma. That proper belief became the thing that was being worshiped instead of God. That proper belief became the primary concern of Christianity rather than adhering to the teachings of Jesus. And for me, that's incredibly problematic. So, thanks to all of you who are watching. This is Question and Perspective. In progressive Christianity, we don't necessarily believe that there is one right answer to every question, but instead that there are multiple perspectives, and I certainly have mine. And so, if you'd like to hear my perspective on any of the questions that you might have, go ahead and put those in the chat, the comment section, wherever it is that you are watching. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and I will see those. I'm doing my best to keep up with those on the various platforms and answer them as I can. So I've got a question on Instagram. It says, this is a very refreshing conversation regarding organized religion. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm glad that it's helpful. Aiden Bologna says, do you believe that the Gospels were anonymous? Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that I've said recently quite a bit that has been a little controversial, but really isn't controversial in academic circles. That the Bible, like all the books of the Bible, were written by people who had never met Jesus. And that's just a historical fact. And the fact that they were attributed to disciples is something that happened later. It did not happen in the first century. They were not originally attributed in that way. And in fact, different communities had different gospels. And so it's not like the early Christian communities had the Bible as we have it now. For the first 4 decades, at least after Jesus's crucifixion, there weren't any gospels, or at least none of the gospels that we have now. And it was mostly just oral tradition. And so then these gospels were compiled for specific communities. And you can see that when you go through and read the gospels, that they have specific concerns, and the concerns are different depending on the different communities. And so Mark is a very humanist gospel. Matthew is concerned with showing Jesus as fulfilling Hebrew prophecies. In Luke, Jesus is a little bit more divine, and he's concerned with social justice. And in John, there's a concern with showing a differentiation between the Jesus movement and the Jewish movement that continued to exist in the synagogues. And Jesus is more divine in that gospel than he is in the others. So yeah, they were anonymous, and they were written later. And so I think that's important to recognize, so that we can approach the Gospels with a little bit of humility. And I'm not saying, when I say that none of the Gospels were written by people who had met Jesus, I'm not saying that they're not valuable. I'm not saying that nothing in there originated with Jesus. But what I am saying is that we need to be careful, because not everything that's in the Gospel that's attributed to Jesus was said by Jesus. And I think the Gospel of John is a pretty clear case in point, that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus speaks in short sayings, and he's using parables as his primary tool for teaching. He's a little cagey about who he is and why he's there. And then the Gospel of John, you've got these long exhortations where Jesus is giving these detailed theological statements, and it's written in this beautiful Greek, and that's just not Jesus. And so I think it's important for us to understand. Okay, one New York Queen says, how do you explain Jesus's teachings to the MAGA Christians so that they can understand? That's a great point. And I think I just did a video on this not too long ago about how I don't think, actually, I know you can't be support the MAGA agenda and also follow Jesus. It's just not something you can do. And in this video I just posted, I said, you can't follow Jesus who says that you've got to care for those who are poor and those who are hungry and thirsty while you're cutting programs for people who are poor, hungry, and thirsty. You can't say that you follow Jesus who welcomed the immigrants while it's saying that nobody can come into this country. You can't follow Jesus who distributed free healthcare while cutting healthcare. You can't follow Jesus who is all about changing the economic system while saying that you're going to give all your money to billionaires. And so, honestly, I think the way that you confront MAGA movement is with the gospel, because the gospel of Jesus Christ tells us that we cannot have these beliefs and still call ourselves a Christian. We cannot follow the teachings of Jesus and support MAGA Donald Trump, because what makes America great again actually diminishes the reign of God on this earth. So John DeBona on Facebook says, how important is discernment in today's world? I think that's a good question. I think that discernment is an interesting concept, and depending on what type of discernment we mean, I think we could all use taking a little bit of time to think about think things through a little bit more than sometimes we do. And I think that discernment, like thinking through things, figuring out what path is best, and I mean this both spiritually and politically, I think is something that's helpful. And certainly, if we're talking about political discernment, that we don't see a lot of discernment happening these days. We more see a lot of rash action that has all kinds of consequences that are maybe intended by the Trump administration, maybe not, I don't know. But I do think that certainly political discernment by everyone who's in power could be important. But I think if we're talking about spiritual discernment, that's important too. And, when I think about spiritual discernment, I also think about how it is that we come to our beliefs, our faith, and spending a little bit more time thinking through our faith, why we believe what we do, and what other traditions might have to teach us, how they might inform our faith, I think is valuable. And in my own personal journey, studying Buddhism has been very helpful for me to think about how it is that I'm connected to others, how it is that I'm centering myself and valuing the present moment. And traditions like Taoism have informed my very view of what it means to follow God. And so I think discernment is really important. Thanks for that, John. So someone has asked on TikTok, again, one in my queen, what kind of a Christian am I? And I suppose I would say I strive to be an authentic Christian. I do my best to be an authentic Christian. I belong to 3 different denominations: the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which, despite its weird long name, is an incredible religion, an incredible tradition. It values the responsible freedom of belief and individual biblical interpretation, and using your loving God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul. And so that is that denomination. And then the United Church of Christ, which is sister denomination to the Disciples, and the Progressive Christian Alliance. And so I think if you're talking, though, about like overall strategy for how it is that I approach the Christian tradition, I consider myself to be a progressive Christian. And there's a lot of questions about what it means to be a progressive Christian. And to me, it really is about authenticity and following Jesus. That if we are really trying to follow the teachings of Jesus, then it means that we are trying to make progress towards what he called the basileia of God, the reign of God, the kingdom of God on earth. And I think all Christians ought to be trying to follow that teaching, trying to make progress towards a better world. And if we're not doing that, we're not really following Jesus. So back on Instagram, Aiden Bologna said, "What are your thoughts on the Prophet Muhammad?" So I do think that there is truth to be revealed in all religious traditions. And certainly, I've spent a lot of time studying a number of religious traditions. My undergraduate degree is in religious studies, and from a secular religious studies department in a public university. And so I have been engaged in the academic study of religion, including world religions. And so I think that there is value in all different religious traditions. I find a lot to admire in Islam, especially the dedication and faithfulness that Muslims exhibit. And, if you're talking about looking back to historical figures like Muhammad, Marcus Borg is a Christian theologian who says that there have been a number of spirit people in history, people who have been more connected to the divine, more ingrained with what the divine is doing in the world. And he said there have been a number of spirit people, including the Buddha and Confucius and Lao Tzu and Jesus and Muhammad. And they're just people who come along who tend to be more in tune with the spiritual nature of life. And I think that certainly Muhammad was one of those people. I think that it can be tough whenever you look back at people like several centuries back in time, that people engage in things that we would find morally problematic with 21st century eyes. And so I think that it's best to just acknowledge that, and acknowledge that cultures were different in certain in different times than they are now, and there were different values. So I think that certainly also happened with Muhammad, that there were things that we would find morally problematic with 21st century eyes. But I do appreciate Islam and my Muslim friends, certainly. So I am live on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, wherever you are. This is a round of question and perspective. So if you have a comment, question, go ahead and put it in the comment section, and I will address it as I'm able. And this is question and perspective. So you're asking your questions, and I am giving my perspective based on the questions that you have placed. So I'm grateful that all of you are here and joining. So back to TikTok here. Phantom B has said, "Why did some 3rd to 6th century Christians advocate for the dictator God narrative?" Well, I think that when you start talking about this time period, this is a time period in which there is a fundamental shift in Christianity. That around this time, the 4th century in particular, late 4th century, and then onward, Christianity goes, in the way that I was talking about earlier, from being a persecuted religion to the religion of the persecutor. That when Constantine decided to make Christianity a legal religion and called the ecumenical councils, that made like an orthodox religious tradition, and it made it legal to be Christian. So it was so safe to be Christian all of a sudden. And then a few decades later, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, then it became a tool of empire and has continued to be a tool of empire. So I think all of a sudden, talking about God as a dictator, and that was something that was more acceptable because of what was going on in the time. It was something that was okay. Before that, you wouldn't have wanted to see God as a dictator. You wanted to see God as a liberator. And I do think it's important to note that whenever Jesus was declared the Messiah, that what his followers were declaring was that he was their king. And they hoped that he would overthrow the Roman Empire and he would establish a Roman, or he would overthrow the Romans. He would establish a united kingdom of Israel, and that was the hope that he would rule as an earthly kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And that's not what he did. Instead, he talked about God ruling our hearts. And that was a shift from what was expected. And it also meant that it was a shift in the language that God was talked about. Okay, so what other questions do you have? Place those wherever you are watching this. I see Progressive Eva is a nominally UCC pastor, and so I'm grateful that you are joining as well. And I understand what it means to be nominally belonging to a tradition. And so I know that a lot of us who are on here might even consider ourselves nominally Christian with all of the ways that Christianity has been co-opted in recent years. And I guess in recent years, I mean over the past 4 decades, as the fundamentalist takeover has occurred and fundamentalists have controlled the narrative on what it means to be Christian. And I do think that's also why it's so important for those of us who really want to follow the authentic teachings of Jesus, which have to do with peace, compassion, and justice. It's why it's important that we claim those titles, that title of Christian, and we proclaim loudly what it means for us to be a Christian. Because I don't think it's fair that that conservatives, that fundamentalists have had the loudest voice, and they've co-opted what it means to be a Christian. Oh, you're an evangelical UCC pastor, and so you are on the fringe because you're on the more conservative side. I see, yeah, and that is one thing that's interesting about denominations that allow a responsible freedom of belief, is that you do get a variety of opinions and you do get a variety of interpretations. And I think that as long as we're embracing that word responsible freedom of belief, that it can be a beautiful thing to have people who come from different perspectives and can embody what it means to disagree on the less important things and to agree on the important things still, because we don't have a lot of places in our society where that happens. And if we are able to live that out, then that's really important. You know, I do sometimes have people say, well, you can just believe whatever you want. And that's actually not true. The responsible freedom of belief, I think, means that we have an intellectual obligation to use like intellectual rigor to ensure that our faith passes what we know to be true about history and science and socio-historical context. So I think we have to pay attention to that stuff. But I think that there are also things that we can never really know. And so having a bit of humility about the things that we don't know is also important. For instance, I can say what I think to be true about what happens after we die, or I can say what I believe personally. But I can't say for sure what happens. I don't know absolutely what happens, and none of us do. And so I think approaching that with humility is important, and having a diversity of opinions about that is fine and good and healthy. I think the same is true about exactly how we understand God, that we can say what it is we individually believe about God, but none of us knows exactly how God works in the universe. And so I think that that's important. So thanks for sharing that. So here on Instagram, Dezome says, What are not the legitimate mainstream Christian churches standing? Uh, why aren't the legitimate mainstream Christian churches standing up and combining their efforts to do something about the evangelical political Christian movement? I think that is an incredible question and a very important question. And I think something that is incredibly challenging too. And so, through my work with progressive Christianity, over 2024, we really tried to organize progressives and moderates uh, and reasonable people to join forces against the election of Donald Trump. And one thing that we discovered is that on the left, it can be really hard to get everyone to work together. It can be really hard to convene people. And that is one thing that the right does really well is give marching orders. And part of it has to do with the fact I think that on the left we do value diversity. Diversity, excuse me, of opinions, of beliefs, diversity of approaches. And so whenever it comes time to work together, it can be challenging. That said, you said specifically mainstream churches, and I think like mainline churches have a whole lot in common. And instead of navel gazing and trying to figure out how they can keep their old, outdated buildings open and systems running, that if instead of doing that nasal gazing, they would look out into the world, I think they might find one, that they're more effective, that they're able to organize together, that they're able to make a difference in the world. And it probably would do good for the church themselves. That if they were concerned with the actual mission and teachings of Jesus instead of committees or whatever, then maybe people might be more interested in what they're doing because maybe they serve a purpose. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think that it's time for certainly mainline Protestant churches to work together, but not just mainline Protestants. I think it's time for Protestants and Catholics. I think it's time for Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists to all organize together and to say, hey, people of faith and people of good conscience all find it morally problematic, morally reprehensible, even, that the Trump administration is specifically targeting marginalized groups. This is something that's offensive to us in all of our different religious traditions, that we find it morally reprehensible that the Trump administration is targeting all of these marginalized groups and trying to strip away rights. And so if we can find a way to do that, I think it's important. One of the things that I am working on doing over the course of this year is uniting progressives around the idea of confronting the Trump administration. And so, yeah, I think it's something we all ought to do. I have been somewhat heartened that denominational leaders have at least taken stances on ethical issues, that that denominations, by and large, especially mainline Protestant denominations, have taken stances against the genocide in Gaza, that they've taken stances against transphobia and homophobia, that they've taken stances against the Trump administration's immigration policies. And so I think that those are all good first steps. But honestly, that they're just first steps. And we've really got to organize, we've really got to mobilize if we're going to ensure the survival of our democracy. So thanks to all of you who are tuning in for this round of question and perspective. I'll answer a few more questions here. If you want to have one of your questions addressed, if you want to place those in the comments section, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, I can see all of those, and I will do my best to give my perspective on those questions as they come up. So another question that I am seeing here is, how is it that we embrace people of other traditions while disagreeing with them? And I think that that's a good question. That right now, it's important to recognize that you don't have to agree with everybody on every little thing to respect them as human beings. And theologically, if we believe that each and every person is created in the divine image of God, that each and every person is a reflection of God's divine image, then we have a moral obligation to respect and care about those people, even if, especially if they come from different places than we do. And I mean that like locationally, theologically, whatever. That if people are different from us, that just means they're a reflection of the divine image, and we still need to accept them. We especially need to accept them and see God reflected in them. And so if we are denying people, we are denying God. And so certainly that's true about people of other faiths. And I think it's important to recognize our differences, to not gloss over our differences, because that's something that on the left sometimes we can do too. We can say things like, oh, well, we're all really the same. And I mean, yeah, we're all human beings, but we do have differences, and different religious traditions embrace different things. And I think it's okay to say, hey, look, uh, I find this piece of this religion really compelling, but this piece doesn't speak to me, or I find this piece really challenging. And we believe different things about how we go about justice, for instance, or what prayer means to us. It's okay to have a difference of opinion about that, but we still need to respect the other traditions and see people as holy. I think, by the way, that when we're talking about seeing each and every person as a reflection of God, as a reflection of the divine image, the Imago Dei, that this has particular weight when we're thinking about LGBTQ plus people, because LGBTQ plus people are all too often dehumanized and are told that they are less than. And unfortunately, this often happens by the church, in the church. And if we believe that each and every person is a reflection of the divine image, then that means that gay people are a reflection of God, that trans people are a reflection of God, that no matter where you are on the sexual orientation or gender identity spectrum, that you are a reflection of God. And so if we deny people who are LGBTQ plus identifying, it means we are denying God. If we hate people who are LGBTQ plus identifying, it means we are hating God. And so even though a lot of people say, oh, well, we have a religious obligation to condemn the sin, that's just not true. There is no reading of scripture that is loving and condemns LGBTQ plus people. The only way you can do that is if you're cherry picking verses and taking them out of context, which, as we know, unfortunately, uh, people are wont to do, to cherry pick verses and take them completely out of context, which isn't helpful. So Miss Cake says, if I want God to work in anyone's life, it is the people I think most are wrong. And yeah, I get that. That uh, there are some times when you just say, you need Jesus, or come on, people, you're wrong. But I do think there's a difference between a simple difference of opinion and an ethical difference, right? And so I think right now what we're seeing in our country is primarily a difference in morals, a difference in what we consider to be right versus wrong. And that's different than like agreeing about something simple like whether or not you can put pineapple on pizza, right? I'm pro pineapple, by the way. I know that's a controversial opinion, but that's okay. You can agree with me about pineapple on pizza, and it doesn't say anything about our value as human beings or about who's right and who's wrong. But if we really believe Jesus's teachings that we are to care for people in need, and then we are supporting legislation that dehumanizes people, that's clearly wrong. That's a moral issue. That's not simply a difference of opinion. That's a difference of morals. And so I think that if we're claiming to follow the teachings of Jesus, then we have to be willing to follow the morals of Jesus as well. So one NY Queen again says, do you agree with the Trump Bible being taught in our schools? Well, I'm going to assume maybe that you don't mean the actual Trump Bible, like the one that he was selling for $69.99 or whatever that was. That I don't think a branded Bible, a personal branded Bible, is ever a good idea and always misses the point. But if we're talking about, uh, I, I think the Bible being taught in school generally is not a good idea unless it's being taught as a piece of literature, and that's because of the separation of church and state. And so I get accused a lot of being too political and violating the separation of church and state. I have every right as a pastor to name the political spaces where I don't feel like we are living up to the teachings of Jesus. I also have every right to say when politicians are not living up to the teachings of Jesus, are acting in an immoral way. That doesn't violate the separation of church and state. That is something that I have an ethical obligation to do. However, whenever we do things like teach religion in public schools, that's a violation of the separation of church and state because it clearly favors one religion. You know, the First Amendment to the Constitution says that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion, the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the Free Exercise Clause. And so that actually violates both of those clauses because you are, in essence, establishing a religious tradition when a government funded institution endorses a particular religion. In this case, if you're teaching the Bible, it clearly favors Christianity. And it prohibits other religious traditions free exercise. So you may feel like if one religious tradition is being taught in a public school, then you can't freely practice your own religion, and that is really dangerous. I think this is true too whenever you're talking about things like putting the Ten Commandments in public spaces. That clearly favors the Judeo-Christian tradition. That clearly talks about God too. It's not simply ethical guidelines. Now, all that being said, as I said earlier in the live, I was trained at a public university in a secular religious studies program. So I actually think it's valuable to learn about religious traditions. I just think it needs to be done in a way that is non confessional, right? So a confessional religion is when you confess belief about something. And I think that we should learn about religion, but from a kind of a standpoint where we're standing back, not evaluating whether or not it's true about God or about the world, but studying what different religious traditions believe. And so, as I was learning about other religious traditions, I read a ton of other sacred texts. I learned about how those texts were composed, just like I learned about how the Bible was composed. And I learned about other religious traditions and what adherents believe and how it is lived out in practice. And that gave me a sense of real appreciation for other religious traditions and really helped me to understand more about other religious traditions. And so I really valued that. And that's something that I think can be done in public education. It's also something I think we should be doing in religious communities. And so during Lent, a couple of times ago, or a couple of years ago, I decided to take my congregation on field trips. We read Barbara Brown Taylor's Holy Envy, in which she talked about learning about other traditions and about things that you could learn about other traditions. And so I preached on different religious traditions during Lent. And then I took my congregation on field trips in which we visited other religious traditions and we got to see how they worshiped and learn about them. And that was incredibly helpful, I think, for the congregation. So TWHMT on TikTok says, "What's your church?" Well, the church I serve is University Christian Church. It's in San Diego, California, and it is both online and in person, of course. And you are welcome to join in person if you're ever in beautiful, sunny San Diego, or always online. And you know, if you're watching a part of this TikTok, no matter, or TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, if you're watching this, you're a part of our church community. You know, whether you agree with me or not, we're grateful for you, and we consider you a part of our church community. And so you're always welcome to participate in that in however you feel. And then my denominations are Christian Church Disciples of Christ, United Church of Christ, Progressive Christian Alliance. Then back to Facebook here. Linda Van Heer Hatch says, do you believe God is a big person? I believe everything is within God. I'm more comfortable with spirit of force. And I've got to say, Linda, I'm right there with you. So I don't think about God as a being personified. That's not something that really speaks to me. And I tend to view God more as a force as well. And so certainly I don't think about God as an old guy in the sky. And I recently preached a Giving Up Bad Theology series. And one of the things that we gave up was an old guy in the sky, God. And so I think that giving that up is good. Again, I think I'll lean on Barbara Brown Taylor, who just has so much wisdom. She talks about God as a luminous web. And her idea is that there is this web of creation that connects us all. That, close your eyes and picture all living things connected by a web. And if there's a web, and it kind of vibrates at one end, that sends reverberations throughout the entire web. And so I think that is an important way to think about God, that like if we are putting good things out in the universe, if we are doing good, then that has positive reverberations throughout the web. And that's the way that we create the reign of God, for instance, is by sending reverberations throughout the web. But also, if we act poorly, then that also sends reverberations throughout the web. In fact, it can even create a hell on earth. And so I think it's important to think about how it is that we act in the world and how it is that we act affects others. And for me, a view of a God that is with us and is pulling on us and pushing us, and if we're open to it with us, then I think that's something that really speaks to me. And this is one of the places where Taoism has really informed my faith, is that in Taoism there is a view that there is this way, this force that is in the world, the Tao, and if you are open to it, it is there leading you, guiding you. And so I tend to think about God in that way, that if we are open to God, then I think that God is there, and we can and that can inform our faith. So I see on back to TikTok here, I see a conversation going on between the progressive Eva and Miss Cake. And one of the things that I see is liberal Christians have to figure out what they're offering beyond progressivism. This is something I think that I'm accused of a lot, is that really, Caleb, you're just giving progressive talking points and not really following the teachings of Jesus. And I would say that I think what informs that is a view that what Christianity is primarily about is believing the right things about Jesus. And that if you believe the right things about Jesus, then you're offered an eternal reward. I would say that whole theology that has become the predominant narrative of Christianity in the United States is a bastardization of Jesus's message. That is not what Jesus was concerned about. That Jesus spent the most of his ministry, the primary part of his ministry, talking about how it is that we create the reign of God on this earth. And the way that we do it is peace through the presence of justice. And the way that we do it is by letting the peace of God rule our hearts. And then for that message, whenever he talked about loyalty to God over and against the Roman Empire, the Romans crucified him for that. And then his followers instead of continuing his message, talking about the reign of God on this earth, they instead started talking about Jesus. And so that then has a fundamental shift. If you're not focused anymore on the creation of the reign of God, then instead you're focused on Jesus. Well, then instead of action, you're focused on belief. And so that is a fundamental shift. I think it's also important to note that other than Jesus, probably the most important person in the creation of Christianity was Paul. And a lot of the theology that we end up with is Pauline theology instead of maybe Jesusian theology, Jesus's theology. And I think that that's important. And so I think that, yeah, that saying that Jesus wasn't concerned with justice or didn't use the word justice kind of misses the point, because I don't think you can read the Gospels in which Jesus is advocating for those who are poor, oppressed, and marginalized. When you see Jesus breaking down social barriers with people who are living on the margins, or women, foreigners, people who've been ostracized because of skin conditions or being ill or because they're possessed or whatever. I don't think you can see Jesus being in solidarity with those people, spending time with those people, breaking down the social barriers with those people, and then say, well, I don't think Jesus was concerned with justice. And if you do, I would suggest you might have missed the point of the gospel, that it's really important that that we see Jesus's message as peace through the presence of justice. And I'm just going to point one thing out, and then we'll end here in just a couple of minutes. I want to end on this point that Rome also offered peace, but the Pax Romana, the great Roman peace, was really only Pax if you were Romana. That if you were Roman, then sure, you could find peace. But if you were an oppressed group in the Roman Empire, no peace. And so Rome talked about bringing peace, but the way that Rome brought peace was through conquest and violence. That they would see a place that they wanted and they would conquer it. And then, as long as you were willing to submit to the Roman Empire, then you could be a part of the Pax Romana. Jesus was talking about a different kind of peace. Jesus was not talking about peace that came through violence and conquest. Jesus was talking about peace that could only be established whenever everyone had enough. Jesus was talking about peace that could only be established if marginalized groups had what they needed. And so I think that if we are truly following Jesus, then we're living out those teachings and not giving in to empire and Rome. So thank you all for being here. Glad that you were able to join wherever you were watching. And if you have other questions, I'm grateful to answer those as I can in DMs. I can't answer all of them. If you subscribe, I have subscription channels across platforms. If you subscribe, I do prioritize those questions, and I try to do video responses to those. And also, I'm doing a segment on non-canonical gospels that you can find in the subscription parts of the channel. Thanks again for joining, and I'll plan to see you